The night didn't feel special to anyone walking in. It was the kind of bar you stop at because it's nearby, not because you plan to be there. The parking lot was half full, the neon sign flickered like it always did, and the bass from inside leaked through the walls in uneven thumps. People pushed through the door laughing too loudly, already halfway into whatever version of themselves came out after a few drinks. Inside, the air smelled like beer, citrus cleaner, and old wood that had absorbed years of spilled liquor. The floor stuck just enough to remind you it hadn't been properly cleaned in a while. Bartenders moved fast, but without urgency, sliding plastic cups down the counter, calling out names no one answered to. It was crowded in that loose, unorganized way where everyone kept bumping shoulders and saying sorry without meaning it. She stood near the bar, not leaning, not hovering, just there. One hand around a drink she hadn't finished, the other resting casually by her side. Her jacket was dark, practical, nothing stylish about it. No jewelry worth noticing. No dramatic posture. If you glanced at her, your eyes would move on immediately, like she was part of the furniture. Around her, conversations overlapped. Someone argued about a game playing on the muted TV. Someone else complained about work. Laughter spiked and dropped in waves. A group squeezed past her, loud and careless, already drunk enough to forget where their bodies ended and other people began. An elbow clipped her arm. A cup tipped. Liquid splashed down her sleeve and across her jacket, cold and sharp against the fabric. The guy holding the cup laughed first. Not embarrassed laughter. The kind that assumes the moment belongs to him. One of his friends snorted. Another said something under his breath that didn't sound like an apology. They didn't ask if she was okay. They didn't even really look at her. To them, it was just another spill in a place built on spills. She looked down at the wet stain, then back up at the bar. Calm. No sudden movement. No raised voice. She didn't jump or curse or draw attention to herself. She took a small step to the side so the next wave of bodies wouldn't knock into her again. Someone behind her bumped her shoulder anyway. The music got louder. Or maybe it just felt louder as the night pushed on. Glass clinked. Someone dropped something near the jukebox and cursed. The bartender yelled for people to move back. It was chaos in the way people accepted without question because it felt normal for a Friday night. If anyone had stopped and really looked at her, they might have noticed how still she was compared to everyone else. Not stiff, just controlled. Like she occupied her space fully, even in a room that kept trying to take it from her. Her eyes tracked movement without darting. Her breathing didn't change. She didn't fidget with her phone or adjust her clothes. She wasn't there to make a point. She wasn't there to prove anything. She wasn't there looking for trouble or attention. She was there because this was where she'd ended up that night, the same way everyone else had. No entourage, no uniform, no visible rank. Just a woman in a bar, blending into the noise. Another drink spilled nearby, this time not on her. Someone laughed again. The same careless laughter. The kind that fills places like this every night. Built on the assumption that nothing important is happening. That no one in the room matters beyond the next round. That the world outside the bar can wait until morning. The TV flashed highlights no one watched. A server pushed through with a tray held too high. Someone shouted a name across the room. The door opened and closed, letting in a burst of cold air and then sealing it back out. The night rolled forward exactly as expected, ordinary in every visible way, the kind of night that never makes the news, never gets remembered, never seems like the start of anything at all. They acted like it was a joke. That was the first thing anyone would have noticed if they were paying attention. The spill wasn't treated as an accident. It was treated like entertainment. A moment to laugh at, a story to tell later, something small to break up the boredom of the night. One of them raised his cup in a mock salute, sloshing what was left of his drink as if to say it didn't matter. The comment came next. It wasn't loud enough for the whole bar to hear, but it was loud enough for her. A throwaway line, delivered with a grin, meant to get a reaction. The kind of remark people make when they assume there will be no consequences. His friends reacted instantly. One laughed too hard. Another nudged him like he'd said something clever. None of them told him to stop. Disrespect has a rhythm to it. It starts small, casual, disguised as humor. No one says anything outright. They rely on tone, on implication, on the idea that if it's said with a smile, it can't be challenged. If she objected, she'd be the problem. If she stayed quiet, they'd feel justified. Either way, they believed they were in control of the moment. They didn't ask if she was okay. They didn't offer a napkin or even acknowledge the mess. Instead, one of them looked her up and down in a way that lingered just long enough to be uncomfortable. Another leaned closer than necessary, invading space he hadn't been invited into. Their bodies formed a loose wall around her, not blocking her completely, but close enough to remind her they were there. They thought they were reading the situation correctly. A crowded bar. A woman standing alone. No visible allies. No raised voice. No immediate pushback. In their minds, that translated to permission. Permission to tease. Permission to escalate. Permission to turn someone else into the punchline of their night. The laughter wasn't joyful. It was sharp, edged with entitlement. The kind of sound people make when they're trying to impress each other more than they're reacting to anything genuinely funny. Each laugh encouraged the next comment. Each comment pushed the boundary a little further. It was a performance, and they were playing to an audience of each other. She didn't respond the way they expected. She didn't snap back with an insult. She didn't apologize for being in the way. She didn't roll her eyes or storm off. She stayed exactly where she was, steady and quiet, her expression neutral. That seemed to confuse them at first. Confusion quickly turned into irritation. One of them tilted his head, as if trying to figure her out. Another shrugged and said something dismissive, waving a hand like she wasn't worth the effort. The lack of reaction took away the easy win they were looking for, so they tried again, pushing just a bit harder. This was the part they didn't recognize as disrespect because it felt so normal to them. The assumption that their amusement mattered more than her comfort. The belief that the space belonged to them. The idea that they could say what they wanted and move on without a second thought. It wasn't cruelty in their minds. It was just how nights like this worked. Around them, the bar carried on. No one intervened. A few people noticed and then looked away, deciding it wasn't their business. The bartender kept pouring drinks. Music drowned out anything that might have sounded like a complaint. The environment itself supported the behavior by pretending not to see it. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook stillness for submission. They mistook the absence of a reaction for the absence of power. Every assumption they made was based on what they could see and what they believed they understood about situations like this. Their jokes got lazier. Their confidence grew. They leaned in closer, voices dropping as if that made their words less public and therefore less accountable. Each remark carried the same underlying message. You don't matter enough for this to be a problem. To them, it was nothing more than a few laughs and a spilled drink. Just another forgettable interaction in a forgettable place. Something they'd barely remember by morning. Except maybe as a funny story to tell, never realizing that what felt harmless to them had already crossed a line they never noticed because they'd never been on the other side of it. Nothing about her announced who she was. That was the point. Years of training had taught her how to disappear in plain sight, how to occupy a space without claiming it, how to observe without being observed. The skills that mattered most were the ones no one could see. In a place like this, blending in was effortless. Her posture was relaxed, but not careless. Weight balanced evenly. Feet placed so she could move without thinking about it. She wasn't scanning the room in an obvious way, but her awareness stretched far beyond the circle of light around the bar. She noticed who was too loud, who was watching instead of drinking, who moved with intention versus who drifted. It was automatic, like breathing. The jacket she wore had been chosen for utility, not appearance. No insignia, no sharp lines, nothing that suggested authority or rank. Her hands were empty, her stance unthreatening. If someone had tried to describe her later, they'd struggle to remember details. Dark jacket, neutral expression, average height, forgettable. That forgettability was earned. It came from years of learning when to take up space and when to give it away. From understanding that power didn't need to be announced to be real. From knowing that the loudest person in the room was rarely the one in control. She had commanded rooms filled with people who hung on her words. She had made decisions that carried weight far beyond a spilled drink or a careless joke. She had given orders that moved entire units into action. None of that showed on her face now. The men around her had no way of knowing that the calm they mistook for passivity was discipline, that the restraint they read as uncertainty was training. They didn't recognize the way she held her shoulders, loose but ready. They didn't understand why her eyes never lingered too long on any one thing. They assumed power looked a certain way. Louder, bigger, male, obvious. They expected authority to announce itself, to demand attention, to come with visible markers. Uniforms, titles, posturing. Without those, they believed they were safe in their assumptions. Hidden power rarely looks impressive up close. It looks ordinary. It waits. It observes. It doesn't rush to prove itself because it doesn't need validation. It knows exactly what it is capable of, and it knows when that capability matters. She wasn't measuring them as threats. Not really. She was registering them the way someone registers background noise. Present, mildly annoying, unlikely to escalate beyond their own egos. Her assessment was calm, efficient, and largely indifferent. The irony sat heavy in the air, unnoticed. The same people who believed they were untouchable in this moment depended on systems and structures she helped run. The same sense of safety that let them laugh and drink without concern existed because people like her made sure it did. She had stood on briefing decks where every word mattered. She had listened to silence that carried real weight. Compared to that, this was small, manageable, temporary. The bar felt loud only because nothing important was being said. Power, when it's real, doesn't rush to the surface. It doesn't flare up at the first sign of disrespect. It doesn't need to dominate every interaction. It understands timing. It understands consequence. It understands that revealing itself too early can be a liability. The men mistook her patience for tolerance. They thought her lack of response meant they were winning some invisible contest. They didn't realize she was choosing not to engage, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. She had learned long ago that control often meant doing nothing at all, letting people show who they were, letting situations unfold just enough to be understood fully, reacting only when it served a purpose. Around her, the bar continued its messy rhythm. Glasses clinked. Music pulsed. Laughter rose and fell. To everyone else, it was just another night. To her, it was another reminder of how often the most capable person in the room went unnoticed, how frequently authority wore no visible badge, how easily people underestimated what they couldn't immediately recognize, how power could stand inches away from mockery without needing to announce itself. Waiting, fully aware, completely unseen, they decided who she was within seconds. It happened automatically, without discussion, without hesitation. A quick glance, a lazy scan, and the conclusion settled in their minds as fact. Alone, quiet, unimportant, someone who wouldn't make trouble, someone who could be dismissed. Appearances did the work for them. No uniform, no entourage, no visible confidence they recognized as strength. She didn't take up space the way they did. She didn't announce herself with volume or gestures. She wasn't performing. That absence of performance became evidence, at least in their eyes. They had been taught, consciously or not, to read power through shortcuts. Loudness meant dominance. Familiar swagger meant authority. If someone didn't fit the shape they expected, they were easy to ignore. It saved effort. It reinforced comfort. It let them feel secure without actually understanding anything. They assumed her silence meant she lacked a voice. They assumed her stillness meant she lacked options. They assumed her restraint meant fear. Each assumption stacked neatly on top of the last, building a version of her that existed only in their heads. None of them considered the possibility that she was choosing not to react. Choice never crossed their minds. To them, reactions were automatic. Respect was demanded, not earned. If someone didn't push back, it was because they couldn't. They had no curiosity about her. No reason to wonder where she'd come from or what she'd done before stepping into this bar. She wasn't a person with a history to them. She was a momentary obstacle, a background character in their night. That's how assumptions work best. They flatten people. They remove complexity. They turn strangers into categories. Once someone fits neatly into a category, everything about them feels predictable, safe, beneath notice. They spoke around her as if she weren't fully there. Jokes were made with the confidence that they would land unchallenged. Space was taken without asking. Boundaries were treated as optional, flexible things that only applied when enforced. What they didn't realize was how much information they were missing by relying on appearances alone. The steadiness in her posture, the lack of emotional leakage, the way her attention never scattered. These were details that didn't register because they weren't looking for them. They assumed competence would announce itself. They believed authority would demand acknowledgement. They expected strength to look aggressive. Anything quieter than that didn't count. Their own behavior reinforced the illusion. The more they laughed, the more convinced they became that they had read the situation correctly. Confidence fed on itself. Each unchallenged moment felt like confirmation. The bar itself supported the assumption. Dim lights, crowded space, noise that swallowed nuance. It was easy to miss subtleties here. Easy to reduce people to shapes and roles. Easy to believe that nothing unexpected could exist in a place so ordinary. They didn't notice how other people unconsciously gave her space. How no one crowded her from behind. How even the bartender's eyes flicked toward her with a different kind of awareness. Those signals passed by unnoticed because they didn't fit the story they'd already written. Assumptions are comfortable because they protect the ego. If she was insignificant, then their behavior was harmless. If she was weak, then their laughter was justified. If she was invisible, then there was no risk. They never asked themselves what it meant that she didn't mirror their energy. They didn't question why she remained composed when most people would react. They didn't consider that restraint might be intentional rather than imposed. They saw only what they expected to see. A woman standing alone in a bar. Someone easy to overlook. Someone whose presence required no adjustment on their part. In reality, every assumption they made narrowed their understanding of the situation. It locked them into a false sense of control. It blinded them to context, to capability, to consequence. They believed power always needed to prove itself immediately. They believed authority demanded recognition. They believed that if someone mattered, they would make sure everyone knew it. So they relaxed. They joked. They leaned closer. They let their guard down completely, confident in the story they'd told themselves, unaware that the person they'd reduced to an appearance alone existed far outside their expectations, fully capable, fully aware, standing quietly while they mistook absence of display for absence of strength. Authority doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it's already in the room, unnoticed, unacknowledged, operating under the surface while everyone else assumes they understand who's in charge. The men around her believed authority belonged to whoever spoke the loudest, whoever leaned the farthest into someone else's space, whoever acted like the night owed them something. They had no reason to imagine otherwise. In their experience, power was visible. It announced itself. It came with confidence that demanded attention. If someone didn't claim it openly, they assumed it wasn't there. What they didn't see was the chain of responsibility that extended far beyond that bar, far beyond the street it sat on. They didn't see the operations she oversaw, the people who reported to her, the decisions that moved resources and lives in coordinated motion. None of that translated into something recognizable to them in this moment. She didn't correct their assumptions. She didn't feel the need to. Her authority didn't depend on their acknowledgement. It existed independently of their awareness, solid and unchanged whether they laughed or not. There was a strange imbalance unfolding, though they couldn't sense it. The same men who felt emboldened to crowd her space relied on systems designed and enforced by people like her. Their confidence in their safety, their freedom to drink and joke without fear, rested on layers of planning and discipline they never thought about. She had stood at the center of briefings where everyone in the room waited for her direction. She had watched teams adjust instantly to a single word from her. She had carried responsibility that didn't allow for mistakes or ego. Compared to that, this posturing meant nothing. The contrast was almost quiet enough to miss. Men performing dominance in a bar, unaware they were standing inches from someone whose authority extended well beyond their understanding. Someone who didn't need to raise her voice because her words carried weight elsewhere. They mistook proximity for control. Because they were close to her physically, they believed they held the upper hand. They leaned in, crowded, spoke over her silence as if filling it proved something. They didn't realize how little physical closeness mattered to someone trained to command from any distance. Her restraint wasn't hesitation. It was assessment. She wasn't deciding whether she could handle the situation. She was deciding whether it was worth engaging at all. Authority gave her that choice. Experience taught her when to use it. They talked freely, unaware that every assumption they made revealed more about them than her. Their confidence depended on her staying quiet. Their sense of superiority relied on her not correcting them. They needed her to remain what they believed she was. If the roles had been reversed, if they had known who stood in front of them, their behavior would have changed instantly. Voices would have lowered. Apologies would have come quickly. Respect would have appeared where mockery had been moments before. Not because their values would have shifted, but because consequences would have become visible. Authority often works that way. It's respected only when recognized. Invisible authority is dismissed until it's revealed, and by then it's usually too late to undo the behavior that prompted it. She understood this better than they ever would. She had seen how quickly people adjusted when they realized who was giving the orders. She had watched bravado collapse into compliance the moment authority became undeniable. That knowledge didn't make her impatient. It made her observant. It allowed her to watch the gap between who people thought mattered and who actually did. It let her see how easily respect was misdirected toward performance instead of substance. They never considered that the quiet person might outrank everyone they admired. They never imagined that the woman they dismissed could command the kind of loyalty they tried to imitate with volume and bravado. Their world didn't make room for that possibility. So they carried on, confident in their misread. Confident that power had a single shape, a single sound, a single look. Confident that authority, if it existed, would make itself known to them immediately. Meanwhile, the reality sat right in front of them, unannounced, unbothered, fully intact, an authority they couldn't see, couldn't measure, and didn't recognize, standing calmly while they laughed, unaware of how completely wrong they were about who actually held control in that space. They wouldn't realize what had happened until much later, when the night had already slipped out of their control. At first, nothing looked different. The bar was still loud. Drinks were still spilling. Music still pulsed through the room. But something had shifted, subtle and irreversible, and they were the last to notice. It began with small changes they didn't connect to themselves. The bartender's attention lingered a moment longer. A security guard near the door straightened, his posture sharpening as if he'd received an instruction without hearing one. Conversations nearby quieted just enough to create pockets of space. These were not dramatic moves. They were precise. The men continued talking, still riding the confidence of earlier laughter. They believed the moment had passed, that whatever awkwardness existed had dissolved into the noise of the night. They didn't recognize that the situation was no longer about spilled drinks or careless jokes. It had become about judgment. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't announced who she was. She hadn't threatened or demanded. She had done something far more effective. She had spoken quietly to the right person. The kind of exchange that takes seconds and changes everything. From the outside, it looked like nothing. Just a brief conversation. A nod. A shift in tone. But authority doesn't need an audience to work. It moves through channels most people never see, carried by trust and recognition rather than volume. The men felt it before they understood it. A strange resistance in the air. Their jokes landed flat. Their laughter faded quicker than before. One of them glanced around, sensing attention where there had been none. Another adjusted his stance, suddenly aware of how close he was standing. No one explained anything to them. No one needed to. The lesson wasn't delivered through confrontation. It unfolded through consequence. The kind that doesn't announce itself until escape routes start disappearing. A security guard stepped closer, not aggressive, just present. The bartender stopped serving them, citing policy in a neutral tone that left no room for argument. Nearby patrons shifted away, instinctively creating distance. The men exchanged looks, confusion creeping in where confidence had been. They tried to laugh it off, but the laughter sounded forced now. They asked questions that didn't get answered. They protested lightly, then more firmly, still believing this was a misunderstanding they could talk their way out of. They didn't realize the decision had already been made. She didn't look at them anymore. They were no longer part of her awareness. That, more than anything, unsettled them. They had gone from being the center of their own story to irrelevant background noise. Being asked to leave didn't feel dramatic. It felt administrative. Calm. Final. No shouting. No scene. Just a clear direction and an expectation of compliance. The kind of authority that doesn't need to explain itself. Outside, the cold air hit harder than expected. The door closed behind them, sealing off the warmth and noise they'd taken for granted minutes earlier. They stood there for a moment, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. They replayed the night in fragments. The spill, the jokes, the lack of reaction. None of it seemed serious enough to warrant what had just happened. That was the point they couldn't grasp. The lesson wasn't about severity. It was about perspective. They had misjudged the room. They had misjudged the person. They had misjudged how quickly consequences could arrive when power didn't need to posture. Later, when they told the story, it would sound incomplete. They'd focus on how sudden it was, how unfair it felt. They'd leave out the assumptions they made, the boundaries they crossed, the confidence that blinded them. They'd never fully understand why the night turned against them. The lesson would settle slowly, if it settled at all, not as a clear moral, but as a lingering discomfort. A memory of control slipping away without warning. A reminder that not everyone who matters announces themselves, that not every authority looks the way you expect, that some power waits quietly until it's needed and then ends the conversation without raising its voice. They would remember the confusion more than anything else. The moment they realized they weren't in charge. The moment the story stopped being about them. The moment they learned, too late, that the person they dismissed had been the one setting the limits all along.